I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 15 years, hauling everything from dried goods like cereal and macaroni to things like cell phones and computers. It's been a well-paying career, and I've honestly enjoyed it. But there was this one night, around 10 years ago. I was hauling office supplies, pens, paper, halfway across the country. I'd been driving for a long time, but I had a deadline to beat. It was getting pretty late, but my favorite podcast was keeping me company. Listening to guys argue about sports made me feel a little less lonesome. The road gets that way sometimes. Luckily, I had a beautiful fiancée waiting for me at home. But on that night, she was the furthest thing from my mind. I remember cruising down a dark and desolate highway. There were no stores, no houses in sight. It felt as if I were the only person in the entire world. But I was about to be proven very wrong. Within my view, the road was clear and empty, when suddenly, something darted in front of my truck from out of nowhere. With such a big machine, I wasn't able to simply slam on the brakes and stop. To my shock, I hit whatever ran out in front of me. The entire 18-wheeler shook from the collision. I came to a stop as quickly as I could, fearing the worst had happened. That someone had made the fatal mistake of stepping in front of my rig. I killed the engine, taking a minute before I exited the vehicle. If I had hit someone, my life was over. Getting married, having kids, watching them grow, those things wouldn't happen with me sitting in a prison cell. But regardless, I had to check on who, or whatever this was. Though I doubted they survived a head-on collision with a semi. Within my first few steps, I heard a small squelch. Looking down, I saw a pool of blood already forming, and my size 10 boot standing right in it. That's when it hit me, this had to be a human. No animal could lose this much blood. I was positive I had just killed someone. But a few steps later, I was proven wrong. Pinned under the front of my truck was not the body of a human being. Instead, it looked like some sort of creature. I could clearly see that it was dead. But what it was, I couldn't tell you. The thing was a beast, about 6 feet tall. Seemingly canine, with fangs protruding from its mouth. It could have been a large dog, but that didn't seem right. Even though it was stuck, I could see its broad chest and shoulders, as well as 2 long, hairy legs, almost like a man's. The only thing I could compare it to was a werewolf. Absolutely stumped, and unsure of what to do, I called the police. While waiting, I couldn't help but stare at this odd being. I'd never seen anything like it, and now, a putrid smell emanated from its corpse, like an animal that had never bathed before. I'd be so glad when the officers finally arrived. Maybe they could make some sense of this situation. Soon, I was greeted by 2 older men, giving me annoyed looks. I'm sure they had a long day, and didn't care about some dead animal. But their thoughts changed, as soon as they saw this thing. Both men's eyes grew wide, their skin pale. I heard one ask the other if this could be some guy in a costume. They tried to pull it out from under my truck. As they did, the smell became even worse. Seeing the thing's entire body for the first time left us in awe. It was so big, the arms alone were thicker than some bodybuilders, and its sharp claws. I was sure they could rip us apart with ease. I'll never forget how one of the men looked as he spoke into his walkie-talkie. He then approached me, shaking his head before speaking. "Mister, we don't know what you hit, but we're gonna need somebody smarter than us to figure it out. Mind waiting by the car?" Now, I had a load to deliver, but it seemed best to comply. If I'm being honest, it would be nice to figure out what was lying there. After another 20 minutes, a second vehicle arrived on the scene. But instead of a police cruiser, I saw a mysterious all-black car. A man stepped out, wearing a sharp black suit to match. He looked down at the creature for only a brief moment, before letting out a loud sigh. Without saying a word, he approached me. I'd be lying if I said the man wasn't intimidating. Something about the look in his eyes, cold and calculating, like he walked through hell and came back unscathed. He looked at me and spoke in a deep voice. "They've got a lot of cleanup to do here. Let's go to the station and talk about what you saw." Once again, I didn't resist. I willingly went along with this strange man. He drove me to a nearby police station, where I was seated in an interrogation room. I was alone at first, but soon, the man returned with 2 cups of coffee. He looked down, stirring his coffee, and began talking. He told me that what I saw tonight was nothing more than an exotic pet, an endangered one, that was very illegal to own. I couldn't help but giggle. I didn't believe him for a second. I told him it was a stretch, and that it looked more like a werewolf to me. He wasn't amused, slamming his hand on the table and shouting. He told me there was no such thing as a werewolf, and that I needed to realize this wasn't a game. He insisted this was an illegal pet, and wanted me to agree with him. He even said I could lose my job if I didn't comply. Without much choice, I assured him that what I hid was only a pet. He then asked for my shoes, and even gave me a pat down. A few minutes later, he brought me a pair of cheap jailhouse shoes. He told me mine were ruined by the blood, and that he threw them out. I was pretty upset, as those were an expensive pair of work boots, but it was obvious. I had no room to negotiate. He didn't let me finish my shipment either, saying my truck was totaled. I knew this was a lie. The front end was only lightly damaged. I ended up receiving a bus ticket and went back home. I was off the road for 2 weeks, without hearing a thing. Finally, my boss called, putting me back to work. Weeks turned into months, and then years. My fiancée and I got married, and even had a little boy. I continued driving 18-wheelers, never having another incident like that again. My life was mostly normal, but sometimes, weird things would happen. I'd receive phone calls in the middle of the night, asking if I'd seen anything strange. I'd say no, and try to identify the caller, but they always hung up. At times, I'd catch suspicious black vehicles following my rig while I was driving. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, and I prayed it was. Even so, I didn't believe what I hit that night was just a pet. As for its true identity, I'm sure it will forever remain a secret. And if I'm being honest, maybe that's for the best. Around 5 years ago, I finally got kicked out of my parents' house when I turned 18. They had saved up a decent amount of money for me, lined me up with a job and an apartment, fully furnished, cupboards and fridge full of food. Not all parents would do the same, but eventually, they knew I'd be back, and I was determined to succeed in this test as the rest of my older siblings did. The job I got was doing security, which was cool because I wanted to be a cop, and this would be a foot in the door, and would look good as a recommendation. I went through all the background checks and even did the training, which wasn't really bad at all. After being accepted, they sent me on an overnight assignment at a gated community that stretched a few miles around. Really upper-class place, so clean and unbelievable that a place like this even existed. I was partnered with a guy named Steve, who had been there for over a decade. He was one of the coolest, most laid-back people I'd ever met. He trained and walked me through all the procedures, protocols, and such, basics. It was a really sweet gig, because lunch was also provided, and they gave us these little carts to drive the grounds on when patrolling. It was me, Steve, and 2 others on the other side of the community. So that's 4 security guards in total, guarding a huge patch of land that was basically in the middle of nowhere. The scenery and quietness away from the city was a nice change of pace. During my first week of doing the night shift, my coworker Steve told me all kinds of stories about the community and its people, who all seemed friendly. So friendly, in fact, that some would bring us snacks, and sometimes a full-course meal. It showed how deep their gratitude ran around this place. I had even made a friend on the grounds. His name was Jack, but the other security guards called him Old Man Jack. He was this scruffy old man who walked slowly, wearing a deep red cardigan sweater, khaki pants, and slippers. Once or twice a week, he'd stop by the security hut and come have a conversation with me and Steve. But Steve didn't seem interested in chatting with Jack, and I always wondered why, but didn't want to pry. Old Man Jack would tell me stories about his time and service in the war, and would tell the craziest stories. Sometimes they seemed far-fetched, but I'd just listen. When old Jack would start talking, there was just no stopping him. He was funny and wholesome, which gave me a good vibe about him. Usually, his visits would last a good 20 minutes to a half hour, and I didn't mind it. Most shifts, I'd be happy to sit and chat with him, while Steve would just watch TV in the hut. One early morning, I had just finished talking with old Jack. I sat beside Steve, who seemed unbothered as I watched Jack walk down the road. I asked Steve, "What's up with you? You don't like Jack or what? What's the story there?" Steve just scoffed. "It's nothing like that, kid. I just try to stick to myself around here, you know?" I found it odd that he didn't like talking to Jack, so I pressed on. "So why don't you like talking to Jack? He seems cool to me." Steve sighed softly, picking up the keys to the cart and standing up. "Let's go for a ride, kid." We got into the cart and made our way towards the east side of the community, past the gate and into another section of the community. We ended up at the graveyard, which had a few hundred gravestones. Steve started talking as we got out of the cart, and began making our way through several rows of headstones. "I've been here a long time, kid, and so has Jack. He was a good man." Steve then pointed his flashlight at one specific grave. "He was a good man." I looked at the headstone, and saw the name, Jack Cunningham, 1912 to 1999. Just at the sight of that, the blood in my face flushed, as it chilled down my spine, shook my entire body. "What?" Steve scoffed once more. "He's been dead a long time. He comes by and talks to us once in a while, and it's a usual thing around here. He doesn't know he's dead, so we don't tell him. That's why he seems off at times, you know? He doesn't know the year, doesn't know his grave is here, and we like to keep it that way." Then I started to understand what Steve was telling me. He was basically telling me that I had been talking to the ghost of an old man who had been dead for 24 years. I couldn't believe it. It's been 4 years now, and I'm still at the same job. Yes, I still see old Jack a few times a week, and he tells the same stories. For his sake, I don't tell him his ghostly condition, just as the other seasoned security guards don't. And to be honest, he's given me the best life advice I'd ever gotten from anyone. There are times when a cold chill runs through me when we talk. He'll ask if I'm alright, and of course, I say yes and shrug it off. But also, in a weird way, he's become one of my best friends. Old Jack was a war vet, unmarried, no kids, just an old, lonely ghost who likes to talk and seeks company from a friendly person. I really hope he doesn't find out his state of death. But I try to refrain from those kinds of conversations with him, because I don't want to lose a good friend. Someday, hopefully, he finds the rest in peace he very well deserves. I used to think the world was cruel, but never arbitrary. When my wife left, taking with her the remnants of a life I thought was ours to build, I tried to find reason in the wreckage. I told myself that the camping trip with my kids would be a fresh start, a way to rebuild what had been shattered. Now, sitting in the dark with their bodies cold beside me, I know better. The world isn't just cruel, it's indifferent. And sometimes, that indifference takes on a shape you can't begin to comprehend. The climb was supposed to be easy, a 3-day hike up a decent peak that the guidebooks described as family-friendly. By the time we reached the campsite at the mountain's base, I could feel the tension crackling between us, like static in the humid air. James, my oldest, had barely spoken since the divorce. Emily, just 12, was glued to her phone, even out here where the signal was sporadic at best. And little Tommy, 8 and always the peacemaker, tried his best to keep everyone smiling. But there was an unease in his eyes, a glint of something I couldn't quite place, like he could sense something the rest of us couldn't. I ignored it, convinced myself that I could fix us with s'mores and ghost stories around the campfire. But that first night, as the fire crackled and the forest around us grew silent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows felt too thick, the trees too close, as if the forest itself was leaning in to hear our whispers. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine, but beneath it lingered something else, something sharp and sour, like a wound festering just out of sight. Emily was the first to notice. She had wandered off to pee, and when I heard her scream, the sound sent a jolt of terror straight to my heart. I found her standing over something in the dirt, her face pale as the moonlight that filtered through the trees. A dead rabbit, throat slashed open, its insides arranged in a grotesque spiral, like someone or something had been playing with it. The sight of it made my stomach turn. "Dad, who would do this?" Emily's voice was trembling, and I could see the fright in her eyes. "It's just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe a fox or something. Come on, let's get back to the fire." But the unease only grew as the night went on. I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things rustling in the bushes, twigs snapping, the low murmur of voices just beyond the circle of light. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that rabbit, its dead, glassy eyes staring back at me, and I couldn't help but wonder if it had been placed there. A warning. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of the forest closing in around us, the trees uprooting themselves and marching toward our campsite. They loomed over us like ancient, vengeful gods, their twisted branches reaching out to snatch us up. I woke in a cold sweat, the fire reduced to embers, and found Tommy standing at the edge of the campsite, staring into the woods. "Tommy," I hissed, not wanting to wake the others. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, silhouetted against the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, something shifting in the shadows, something watching us. Then he turned to me, his eyes wide and vacant, his voice eerily calm. "It wants a sacrifice, Dad." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "The rabbit," he said, his voice too flat, too emotionless for an 8-year-old. "It wasn't enough. It needs more." 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. This wasn't normal, this wasn't my son. I knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. "Tommy, listen to me. There's nothing out there, okay? You're letting your imagination carry you away a little too much." But he shook his head slowly, and when he looked up at me, there was something wrong in his eyes, something dark and unrecognizable. "It wants one of us, Dad. It said you do." The next morning, I found another dead animal near our tent, this time a squirrel, its tiny body mutilated beyond recognition, its blood smeared across the ground in a grisly pattern that made my skin crawl. I felt my world closing in, the weight of something terrible pressing down on me. I couldn't let my kids see this, I couldn't let them feel the same that was gnawing at my insides. But the signs kept coming. That evening, Emily found another carcass by the creek, a deer this time, its legs twisted at unnatural angles, its eyes plucked out. James, normally so stoic, grew sickly pale and started hyperventilating, his teenage bravado crumbling under the mounting dread. "I don't know what's going on," I confessed to them, my voice firm. "But we're leaving first thing tomorrow. I'm not taking any chances. We'll be okay. I promise." In a desperate bid to get help, I decided to climb higher up the mountain during the last hours of sunlight, hoping to get a signal and call my close friend to come pick us up. I told the kids to stay behind and keep an eye on the gear. As I began my ascent, the rock face loomed above me, jagged and sheer. My hands gripped the rough stone, each move a test of willpower as I navigated the vertical climb. The fear of falling gnawed at me, each footstep on the narrow ledges feeling like it could betray me at any moment. After half an hour of grueling ascent, I reached a narrow ledge. I set up my phone, trying to get a signal to call for help, but the connection was intermittent at best. Anguish clawed at me, and I started to consider other options. From below, I heard Emily's voice calling up to me. "Dad, we found the drone remote." I had packed the drone along with all of my other gear. I pulled it out from my backpack, attaching my phone to it as Emily and James suggested. The drone hummed to life, and I watched as it ascended, hoping that getting above the tree line would improve the signal. The drone rose higher, wobbling in the air. James was at the controls, but his nervous hands were unsteady. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I think I lost control." The drone veered off course, and before I could react, it collided with a tree branch, plummeting to the ground below. My heart sank as I watched the drone crash, my phone shattering on impact. There was nothing more I could do then. The descent was even more risky in the dark. The sheer drop from the rock face loomed large as I climbed down. I had to navigate narrow ledges, my body pressed against the cold stone, each movement a precarious balancing act. Every slip of a foot sent shivers of fear through me. As I reached the ground again, Emily and James were panicking. I tried to calm them down, hugging them tight thinking their reactions were from our prior experiences, steadily asking them to tell me what was going on. Tommy should have stayed at our tent, but he had simply disappeared just after sunset without them noticing. I called for him, frantically running, demanding Emily and James stay close together. My flashlight beamed through the living darkness. I found him standing in a small clearing surrounded by a circle of stones. His arms were outstretched, his head tilted back, and he was chanting something low and guttural, something that didn't sound human. I rushed to him, grabbing him by the shoulders, but he didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his lips moving in a strange, awful rhythm, and when I tried to pull him away, he lashed out at me with a strength that wasn't his. "It's coming, Dad," he said, his voice distorted, like something was speaking through him. "You can't stop it. But you can make it happy. You can make it stop. What do you want from me?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking under the weight of betrayal and relief, horror and love. "Leave my son alone!" But Tommy just smiled, a cold, hollow smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "It wants you, Dad. It's always wanted you." At that moment, something inside me snapped. The fear, the anger, the guilt, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw myself in front of him, offering myself to whatever dark force was out there, praying that it would take me and leave my children alone. Then Emily and James stepped out of the trees, their faces twisted into mocking grins. "It was a prank, Dad," Emily said, her voice dripping with false innocence. "You were so scared." "What?" "No." My heart pounded as the truth sank in. Surely, there was no way. They had planned this. My own children had faked the whole thing, used the dead animals, the rituals, everything, to mess with me. To punish me. "You think this is funny?" I roared, my voice breaking. "Do you think it's funny to make your father think his own children are in danger?" James's smirk faltered, and I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Regret, fear, I couldn't tell. "Dad, we just wanted to scare you a little, that's all." But Emily's grin didn't waver. "You deserved it," she said coldly. "For what you did to us. For what you did to Mom." My hands trembled as I looked at them, these children I had sworn to protect, who now stood before me as strangers. "We're going home," I said finally, my voice flat. "And when we get back, there will be consequences. Do you understand me?" They didn't answer, just exchanged uneasy glances. But they followed me back to the tent without a word. As I packed up our gear in the early sunrise, I tried to shake the anger that burned in my chest. I couldn't let them see it, couldn't let them know how deeply they had wounded me. I was their father, after all. I had to be strong. I had to keep us together. The path down the mountain was treacherous. We were rock climbing, our hands and feet clinging to the rough stone. The ground below seemed to yawn open, the sheer drops threatening to pull us into the abyss. The only thing I could trust now was that we were an experienced family. Yet I couldn't trust them. What were they willing to do to me, their father. Every tremor in the rock face made my heart race, the vertigo from the height and ever-present terror. We descended, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Despite the sunrise, the forest grew darker, and the air became thick with that metallic tang again, the smell of something festering. The ground beneath us trembled, and the forest erupted. Roots burst from the earth, branches clawing at us, pulling at our clothes, our skin. I let out a guttural, primal sound. The trail twisted into a nightmarish labyrinth of jagged rocks and sheer drops. Tommy being nearest me, I grabbed his small hand, trying to pull him back. The forest was relentless, the roots coiling around his legs, dragging him into the darkness. The ground beneath my feet buckled, and I had to cling desperately to the rocks to avoid being pulled into the chasm that opened before me. "Dad! Help me!" Tommy's scream echoed as he was pulled away, the roots dragging him down into the abyss. James and Emily's screams blended with the howling wind. I tried to reach them, carelessly climbing my way over to them, but the forest was closing in. It was swallowing them up. James fell first, the rocks giving way beneath him, his body vanishing into the darkness below. Emily followed, her cries fading into the void as she was dragged into the chasm. I was left alone, clinging to the edge with electricity jolting through my body, unable to fully grasp anything but my determination not to fall, the knowledge that I could be next. After forcing myself to a narrow ledge, the chaos subsided. The bodies of my children, cold and lifeless, were strewn around me, the forest's gaping maw having claimed them. I stared at their remains, their eyes open but unseeing, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They lay beside me in a surreal display of my worst fear. The forest was still again, the trees swaying gently as if nothing had happened. I was alone, my children's bodies beside me, my mind teetering on the edge of madness. So, I know how it's going to look. The police will come, they'll find the campsite, the bodies buried deep in the forest, and they'll think it was me. How could they not? I can see the headlines now, the news reports dash. "Father goes mad, kills 3 in grisly forest ritual." They'll never believe the truth. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But this is what happened. The forest wanted a sacrifice, and I offered myself. But it took them instead. My kids, my beautiful, innocent kids, taken by something I can't explain, something beyond my understanding. I should have saved them. I should have fought harder. I should have fallen into the pits instead of them. But I didn't, and now they're gone, and their hatred for me is lingering. I have made my way down, sitting here with them alone, waiting for the world to come crashing down on me. I can hear their voices, their evil laughter echoing, their pitch-black feelings for me as their father pulsating, like the forest is mocking me, reminding me of my failure. I can't live with this, yet I must. Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to hear the truth, even if they don't believe it. I didn't truly survive. This mountain let me live.